Speaker, I rise to support the Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga bill, as other speakers from the Labour Party have done as well. Mr Speaker, I do support the notion that previous speakers have mentioned that this is a bill that has gained widespread support from around the Parliament and indeed in the community. That is actually a tribute to the Select Committee, to those who've submitted to the Select Committee and to the government and the opposition politicians who've been part of that. It is not an area where today in contemporary New Zealand there should be, I believe, any particular dispute about the importance of having an organisation within the system of government that does protect and enhance and advocate for our heritage. It was not always so, Mr Speaker, and as I commented during the committee stages of this bill, it's great to see within this bill the strong support, for an example, of the importance of the protection of wahi tapu, wahi tupuna, and historic places and historic areas of interest to Māori. The National Party in the Don Brash era, during the political correctness eradicator times, Dr. Wayne Matt, that was, Mr Goldsmith, if you were wondering whatever happened to, that's right, the MP for North Shore, whatever happened to the political correctness eradicator. During that period, the national government, national opposition as they were then, wasn't all that keen on recognising things like wahi tapu and sacred sites for Māori. So I think it is a good advance that this piece of legislation does that very clearly and very specifically, and I point, Mr Speaker, particularly to Section 7, which gives a special acknowledgement to the way in which this legislation gives effect to the Crown's responsibilities under the Treaty of Waitangi. I welcome that change of heart from the National Party and that we now can have a piece of legislation that gives good recognition to those matters. Mr Speaker, ultimately what this bill does, in addition to some of the specific points that have been raised by the previous speaker, is that it creates a new entity. It creates a governance arrangement for historic places in New Zealand that changes from the model that many New Zealanders have known well, of an historic places trust where there are local branch committees that played an important role in the actions of the trust, that fed through to a national body that in turn played a advocacy role at the national level in terms of historic places and heritage. The recognition is by changing this to being what is effectively a Crown entity, what is effectively a Crown agency, makes the local branch committees inappropriate. It's not really possible for there to be voluntary branch committees that would feed into a government entity in that way. And so, despite some reluctance, I would say, on this side of the House to seeing branch committees disestablished, we understand that the changed governance arrangements do make them inappropriate. And I too want to place on record my thanks to all of those New Zealanders going back many years, many decades, who have contributed to the branch committees of the Historic Places Trust. Many cities and towns in New Zealand would not be the places they are today if it were not for those committee members. And as I think I said in the committee stage debate, I grew up in Dunedin, and there anyone who visits the city of Dunedin can look around on a day-to-day basis and see what an amazing impact local people had on the cityscape, on the fact that those buildings have been presented. And I was actually in the city of Dunedin on the weekend, and I walked past one of the great historic buildings, the old National Bank on Princes Street, and in the building beside it, someone had put a sign up that said, "Sustainability begins with preservation." And I thought that was a very, very good statement of the kind of values that lie behind the protection of heritage in our historic places. We will not be a sustainable community if we don't preserve what is around us, and that counts for historic buildings as much as it counts for our natural heritage as well. So I do want to thank those branch committees. However, I don't think we're here to pronounce the end of local advocacy and representation on heritage issues. Far from it, in fact. And I note that right around the country, Historic Places Trust branches have been re-establishing themselves as part of, I think the organisation is called Historic Places Aotearoa, which is bringing together groups from right across the country. Napier, there's one in New Plymouth, very active one in Christchurch, given the issues that they are facing. And that's fantastic that those individuals and communities can come together and still be advocates for their local heritage, even though they are not officially members of the trust any longer. So I look forward to seeing the advocacy and the support for heritage from those local committees re-established as they are now. It is important when we look at the bill, Mr Speaker, to look at the purposes and functions of Heritage New Zealand, Pouhere Taonga. In particular, I do want to note the fact that it still has an advocacy role. And it is not just a body there to monitor and receive applications and to make reports. Under Clause 11(1)(b) of the bill, one of the purposes and functions of Heritage New Zealand is to advocate the conservation and protection of historic places, historic areas, wahi tupuna, wahi tapu and wahi tapu areas. So I want to make sure we don't suddenly believe that by creating this Crown entity, advocacy is over. And one of the criticisms this side of the House has had of the national government when it comes to the Department of Conservation is that it doesn't want to hear from the Department of Conservation about its advocacy role. It would rather that it went away. Need anyone mention the Tandem Dam if they want an example of that? I want to put on the record of this House that the Labour Party recognises that part of Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Tonga's role will be to advocate, and we support that role. It may mean, Mr Speaker, that we're in government, we may have some disagreement, but we welcome that. We welcome the fact that there is an organisation that has got a specific responsibility to advocate for conservation of historic areas. That is important in our society. Mr Speaker, I want to just refer to a couple of other areas. We've already had a reference by Jacinda Ardern to, I guess in many senses, the relationship between this body, this organisation, and the legislation that sets it up, and the Resource Management Act. And there was a lot of discussion, as I understand it. I wasn't on the Select Committee, but there was a lot of discussion in the Select Committee process about aligning those two regimes. And in fact, a chunk of the Minister's very large SOP is about exactly that. That's important. We've seen too many examples in this House of legislation where alignment with the RMA has been forgotten about. And here I'm thinking about the exclusive economic zone legislation is a very good example of that. So it's important that we align them. But I think what it draws out, and there were submissions, I remember Federated Farmers getting quite upset about this bill at one stage, although they ultimately support it, I think, when they were concerned that there was not enough of a partnership approach in how we support historic places and historic sites. And I guess as representing farmers, they're perhaps concerned about where those historic sites may be on particular farms. I welcome the idea of a collaborative approach, a partnership approach, but there needs to be clear rules and guidelines around that. And I do support the idea of some kind of national policy statement around heritage, so that local authorities and those in the community who have to work in these areas understand the expectations at a central government level about the protection of heritage. I think it would be useful to do that. One of the problems with the implementation of the RMA over many years is the absence of national level guidance in terms of national policy statements and national environment standards. In the absence of those, it's been up to local authorities to come up with decisions. That's where some inconsistencies have grown up. That, if anything, is what needs to change about the RMA, not the fundamentals of it, not tearing down the fact that it's about sustainable management as this government would do, but rather actually giving the national level guidance that allows local organisations to make their decisions. That applies as much to heritage, Mr Speaker, as it does to any other topic. So I think that is a conversation we need to have, but this bill at least gives us an organisation that is now well founded within government to provide the support for our heritage, the protection of our heritage going forward, and therefore the Labour Party can support this legislation.
I call Holly Walker.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Well, the Green Party is pleased